What if the strangest encounters weren't the ones that left people terrified, but actually left them mystified? In today's video, we're looking at two cases that don't fit the usual mould. A family watching lights over a mountain lake, a man driving home alone at 2 a.m. Both encounters left physical traces, multiple witnesses, and questions that were never fully answered. What they called nocturnal lights were a kind of fun entertainment for teacher Stan Hughes and his family. On their frequent visits to a scenic nature spot at Lake Pend Oreille in Idaho, they would sit on lawn chairs and enjoy the view, which would then often morph into a spectacular and surreal sky display come nightfall. The many UFOs, usually small oval-shaped glowing white objects, would dash to and fro across the lake and often manoeuvre elaborately. They would zigzag, instantly stop and hover in mid-air, and then dramatically accelerate to high speeds. There would usually be 10 or 20 of the craft, which family members would track and speculate about where they had come from and were going. The objects appeared to be flying at very high altitudes and usually showed no interest in the group of humans observing them from below. However, occasionally they would swoop down to just a few thousand feet or less before rapidly dashing back upwards and then moving away into the distance. On one particular night, in the summer of 1992, the family were assembled below and witnessing a brilliant display of the dazzling lights whizzing all around above. The lights were more numerous than usual and also seemed to be flying lower and lower. Suddenly, Stan and the others were astonished to see one of the objects advancing directly towards them at about 200 feet above the lake. As they were then sitting up on the bluff, they realized they were staring at it at eye level. Even more amazing was when Stan's young daughter called out to him that the aliens seemed to be communicating with her telepathically. "Daddy, Daddy," she cried, "they're talking to me. What should I do?" Shocked, Stan simply replied, "Tell them you love them." The little girl said, "I love you," to astonishing effect. The UFO flared up so brilliantly that all the family members had to cover their eyes. The blazing bright white light with tones of blue illuminated with such dazzling intensity that they could see their shadows. Stan's mother-in-law exclaimed that they must be reading their minds. After the blazing incandescence, the object rose up and flew directly over their heads to the mountains behind them, leaving all the witnesses with intensely bright after-images on their retinas. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit like. It really helps to keep the channel growing. And if you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest videos. We've got lots of strange and fascinating stories coming up, and we'd love to have you along for the journey. Everyone had perceived the encounter as positive and joyous, Stan now feeling almost a close friendship with the beings. That friendship was to develop strangely in a dramatic encounter occurring 5 years later in 1997. Having dropped off his wife at a teachers' convention near Priest Lake in the same area, Stan decided to spend the night with his dog on nearby Thunder Mountain in Washington State. He had previously spent many nights up there, often watching the nocturnal lights whose paths he had tracked, with the conclusion that there may be an underwater base situated in the very deep lake. On his way out the next morning, he was driving down the old gravel road at the base of the mountain when he felt inexplicably drowsy and had to pull over. He felt himself slipping into a trance-like state to the sound of a strange swishing and whirring as a huge silver metallic sphere descended and hovered about 1 foot above the road directly ahead. Without markings, lights or portholes, it was like a massive silvery balloon appearing about 50 feet in diameter. Almost instantly, a dark oval-shaped door appeared at its front and a 6-foot-tall humanoid figure stepped out. The exceptionally handsome man, appearing Middle Eastern, wore a brown jumpsuit and silver boots. He stepped down and approached Stan's pickup, holding out his hand and smiling. As he and Stan stared at each other, only a few feet apart, Stan was seized by an overwhelming sense of longing, like a powerful déjà vu. He cried out to the man, "Will you take me with you? I don't want to be here anymore. Please take me." In an instant, the man's beautiful smile turned to an expression of extreme sadness. His arm dropped, and he returned to the craft, which lifted up and away. Stan was left with an intense feeling of loss, while his usually vigilant dog had slept peacefully throughout the whole incident. With his engine still running, Stan was sure that he himself had been in full waking consciousness throughout. His sadness, like that over missed kinship, persisted for weeks. Another very strange occurrence may have been linked to the connection felt by Stan. His son stayed in Norway as an exchange student after graduating high school. The family who accommodated him there had lost their own son, whose bedroom he stayed in before returning to Idaho after a year. Soon after that, the young man began to suffer from depression, which was completely out of character. His state worsened and was not improved by the professional help he was receiving. Stan invited his son to accompany him for a camping trip on Thunder Mountain, but when he declined, Stan travelled there with a friend. At around 2 a.m, he was up watching for nocturnal lights, and an object did appear overhead, but was behaving in an unusual way, pulsating and repeatedly edging closer to Stan, then backing up. Each time it came closer, Stan had a feeling of dread as the UFO performed this movement over and over again. He became convinced that the craft was trying to deliver some kind of warning. On arriving home the following day, his gut fear was vindicated when he found his family in a state of crisis. At the exact time the previous night when Stan was watching the strange behaviour of the UFO, his son was experiencing a severe mental health crisis. A few months later, their First Nations family decided to perform a traditional Native American healing ceremony to help with the young man's recovery. The family assembled at Sullivan Lake in northeastern Washington, and Stan's sister-in-law, who was an experienced healer, took charge. After meditating on the young man's problem, she explained that Stan's son was not actually depressed but had a spirit attached to him. She identified this entity as the deceased Norwegian student whose room he had occupied during his time on the foreign exchange program, a soul who had apparently taken his own life. She began to doctor Stan's son and effectively exorcise the spirit out of him. The younger children at the campsite screamed when the deceased spirit suddenly appeared, a frightening apparition which, however, confirmed that Stan's son was now freed of his affliction. After the healing ceremony, he was instructed to jump into the icy lake, and it was at this very moment that a UFO appeared. The family group heard a humming behind them and turned to see the large craft hovering so low that it was shaking the tops of trees. Totally black, but with lights around it. After a few moments, it floated off into the distance. Stan's brother commented that what Native Americans called the Wojay or Star People had been present to celebrate the success of the healing ceremony. While Stan does not strictly follow Native American religious traditions, he is aware of their long history of interactions with the Wojay, who he believes are his ancestors. In a UFO sighting he experienced when young, in 1989, his fellow witness had attempted to communicate with the craft crew in Yakima. The extraterrestrials are seen as wise and helpful visitors who only rarely intervene in earthly affairs, but are working for the betterment of humans. Stan's encounters with UFOs have always been very positive, and he has continued observing the nocturnal lights they display over years. Unusual movements are a sure indicator as the craft speed up and slow down, zap off at a right angle, pulsate with varying brightness, and change directions or stop and take off dramatically. No human plane can do that. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to hit like. It really helps to keep the channel growing. And if you're new here, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest videos. We've got lots of strange and fascinating stories coming up, and we'd love to have you along for the journey. On January 12, 1975, George Oski had just finished all his business paperwork and closed his liquor store in New Jersey at about 2 a.m. He was then heading for home when the 72-year-old decided to take a shortcut through North Hudson Park, a route where he often stopped for a snack at a diner along the way. His detour was to unveil an astonishing close encounter of the third kind. It was around 2:45 a.m. on that night when George was driving through the park, which is just across the Hudson River from Manhattan. Suddenly, static noise filled his radio reception, and he was just leaning forward to adjust the dial when he was distracted by a light to his left. His first quick glance was followed by an astonished stare as he took in the source of the illumination. Clearly visible was a glowing spherical object with vertical, brilliantly lit windows travelling alongside his car on his left. The craft, which was about 100 feet away, was moving in the same direction as his car and emitting a low humming sound. George slowed down so as to get a better view of the bizarre object, noting its round shape and that it was about 30 feet in length. Hovering about 10 feet off the ground, the UFO entered a playing field where it slowed down and seemed to settle. On the side of the craft, a panel opened between two of the vertical windows, and then a ladder-like mechanism emerged, stretching out and descending towards the ground. At this stage, the UFO lowered itself even more, settling at about 5 feet above the ground. Just a few seconds later, a number of small figures, George thought close to a dozen, emerged from the craft, all following each other one by one as they rapidly clambered down the ladder. The diminutive beings, each no more than 3 feet tall, were all identically clad, wearing white one-piece outfits which included even their boots, as well as hoods or helmets which obscured their facial features. George's immediate reaction to their appearance was that they looked like kids in snowsuits. Trying not to make himself too noticeable, George leant forward in his car to observe the strange beings. Each figure was carrying a small bag with a handle from which they retrieved a small spoon-like tool. Each then very industriously dug a hole in the soil with the spoon-like implement and then deposited the dirt they had dug up into the bag they were carrying. The figures then hurried back into the ship, which promptly ascended into the sky and took off toward the north. In recalling his experience, George estimated that the entire incident, from his initial sighting to the being's return to inside the craft, had lasted no more than 4 minutes. He headed home in absolute shock, but also fear, as he was sure that the beings had been aware of his closely observing presence nearby. He finally slept with the covers well over his head like a scared child. The following morning, still unable to process his memory of the sighting, George returned to the area where he had watched the activities of the aliens. Walking in the field where they had landed, he sure enough discovered in exactly the same location he'd seen the beings, over a dozen small holes in the ground. Over the following weeks, on relating his experience to people he knew, he met other witnesses who had seen similar strange events that January night, occurring in the same area. A few months later, George confided his experience to a long-time customer and acquaintance, Bud Hopkins, who had been studying the phenomenon of UFOs. The two men had known each other for 17 years. As a part owner of a wine shop near where Hopkins lived, George was aware that Hopkins respected him as both streetwise and a thinker. Hopkins also knew that, despite George's job selling alcohol, he was a strict, self-proclaimed teetotaler. Knowing George as a man of high integrity, Hopkins found his account very credible for details such as his description of the craft moving as if a giant magnet was attracting it. He enlisted the help of two fellow investigators, Ted Blocker, then director of New York State's Mutual UFO Network, or MUFON, and Jerry Storer, also of MUFON. Both investigated the incident, interviewing George and taking soil samples, and the four men staged a reenactment in the football field where the landing had occurred. They subsequently found independent witnesses who also confirmed the presence of a brightly lit UFO in the park at the time of George's sighting, although only George was close enough to see the small figures. Hopkins became aware that a nearby apartment complex employed a 24-hour doorman and that this person may have witnessed something on the night of George's sighting. He was proven absolutely correct when he introduced himself to a night doorman at the circular Stonehenge apartment block who told him that a fellow doorman had seen something strange in the month of January. Hopkins tracked down Bill Pulowski, who had left the job but disclosed that he had experienced a strange occurrence during the night mid the previous January. One of the apartment block's huge glass entrance windows had shattered under bizarre circumstances. At some time between 2 and 3 a.m., Bill had noticed brilliant lights shining in his direction from a hill inside the park. As he stared in that direction, he made out 10 to 15 lights, all evenly spaced, hovering above ground level. In awed astonishment, he called a tenant in the block, but no sooner had he started to explain what he was seeing, a high-pitched vibration and cracking sound rang out. He turned to see that one of the lobby windows was cracked at the base, the crack growing larger until the whole pane of glass shattered into a million pieces. Having taken cover beneath his desk, by the time Bill looked out, the shining object had vanished. He called the police, who concluded that whatever had shattered the window had not come through and had been some kind of intense high vibration or shock wave coming from above and from the direction of the North Hudson Park. Another doorman, who had also moved jobs, had also seen and heard the identical craft witnessed by George Oski, in the same location, but exactly 6 days to the hour before George's encounter. This suggested that the aliens were regular visitors to that spot. However, it was after Hopkins published an article in the March 1976 edition of the New York City newspaper The Village Voice that even more corroborating witnesses came forward. A young woman named Alice Wamsley and her 12-year-old son Robert approached investigator Jerry Storer after a talk he had given about UFOs, wanting to inform him about their own sighting. They had seen a round, domed craft through their window, hovering near North Hudson Park and the Stonehenge apartments. Alice related that on going outside, the family continued to observe the huge, slow-moving object with its now distinctive rectangular windows. She related that the craft was floating on an angle, almost as if it was looking through people's house windows, and eventually moved away in the direction of the Stonehenge apartments. George Oski's account went on to feature in several newspapers of the time, and also in Bud Hopkins' book, Missing Time. The North Hudson Park encounter involved confirmational evidence, such as the multiple witnesses and presence of remaining physical traces in the soil disturbances. The unexplained radio interference and broken windows are also commonly reported features of UFO activities. Bud Hopkins also constructed a timeline of George Oski's movements on the night of his sighting, and suggested that there is a missing time phenomenon which suggests that he was actually abducted. George would normally have closed his wine shop at midnight and then walked his dog before tackling his paperwork. Hopkins believed that there were at least 2.5 hours of George's time unaccounted for. George also related that the aliens had told him something that night, something that he couldn't grasp or remember. However, when Hopkins suggested that George undergo the then controversial hypnotic regression therapy, he strenuously refused, not wishing to relive his experience. The full extent of George's UFO encounter will always remain a mystery, while there has been some theorising about why ETs would want to collect soil samples. The strange activity indicates a scientific interest in the Earth's environment or geology. It's thought that the beings may have been conducting research or collecting data about the Earth's composition, potentially for analysis and perhaps comparison with other or their own planets.